Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Franz, music director of Your Windsor Symphony Orchestra, and I am super excited to have with me today Borys Medicky. Borys is an incredible musician who joins us at the WSO on a number of occasions throughout each season. He's a harpsichordist. In this particular case, though, he is going to be performing a concerto at the harpsichord by Johann Christian Bach, the son of the famous Johann Sebastian Bach. Welcome, Borys. Good to have you.
Thank you, Robert. It's good to be here.
So, one interesting thing about you, just to kick off right away, is that your undergraduate degree isn't actually in music, is it? It's
That's
in
correct.
physics and astronomy, and then
That's
you went on to study music. So tell me about your fascination with physics and astronomy and how that switched over to your love of music.
well. That's an interesting story, maybe kind of a complicated one, as these things often end up being. But I would say that the connection between what I was doing as a science student and what I'm doing now as someone who plays the harpsichord, in a way, I think it ties into some part of my personality that is interested in sort of looking at the roots or the fundamentals of things. And I say that because physics and astronomy are regarded as the most fundamental of all sciences, right? Physics is the study of the universe at all levels, and astronomy, of course, is at the largest and longest timescale level. And the connection with what I do musically, in my mind at least, is that as someone who plays the harpsichord and is interested in the earlier repertoire, it in some ways is looking at the fundamentals of the repertoire that comes later and is the one that's probably a little better known to the average classical concert audience. So I'm sort of interested in the roots of things. And I think that's what made me interested in science, which was one of my interests when I was younger. And as far as my musical education, I started playing the piano as children often do. It was something that, although I took fairly seriously from the standpoint that I took all the examinations at the Royal Conservatory of Music that's in Toronto that are available to take. And I did the sort of diploma, if you will, which is the ARCT diploma for those who want to go that far. But I never really thought about doing music professionally. And so there you have my, undergraduate experience in a nutshell as someone who took physics and astronomy and graduated with a degree in that. But what happened during that time, a couple of things actually happened. One thing was that when I was doing the science degree, I had really no time to do anything musical. So the conclusion of my piano studies were just overlapping the beginning of my undergraduate years by about 1 year, if I can recall correctly. So I realized that I missed music because I really had no time to do anything but do my science studies. Another thing was that I started to listen to a lot of harpsichord music recordings on tape or CD as I was driving to school every day, because I had a bit of a commute to get to my school. I had a lot of time to listen to music, but not really to sort of do anything hands-on with it. And in a way that let me steep myself in a repertoire that I had always liked as a pianist, but it also introduced me to a huge amount of additional music that I had never played as a pianist, because I think that the piano repertoire, when it sort of delves into Baroque music, it's usually one of three people. It's Bach, of course, Handel, and Scarlatti. Those are the people that are almost always played if you play Baroque keyboard music on the piano. And I found all these other composers I'd never heard of, and I did it in the most old-fashioned way possible. I just went to the public library and I combed through the bins, starting at letter A, and just pulling stuff out and saying, this looks interesting, and I would take it home. And LPs, of course, because that was what was available
Yeah.
back then. I took that stuff home and I started playing it at home, and I learned all these composers that had previously just been music history names to me, right? Dietrich Buxtehude, Georg Bohm, Johann Fischer, people like that. All of them came alive in a way to me that I had never experienced before. And I found I absolutely loved that stuff, and I loved the sound of the harpsichord. And so the final push, as I say, this is a long story, so to make it short, the final push was when I finished my undergraduate degree. I actually was accepted to graduate school, and I was going to do a project in atomic physics, of all things. So in that summer, between the end of undergrad and the beginning of graduate school in the fall, I had the opportunity to go to this major early music festival in Boston, the Boston Early Music Festival, which takes place every second year, every odd-numbered year, if you want to think of it that way. So I went to this biannual early music festival, very much at the last minute too. And of course, this was in the pre-internet days, so everything had to be arranged by telephone calls and letters and that sort of thing. But to cut a long story short, after going to this festival and hearing multiple concerts every day for something like 6 or 7 days in a row, it was sort of like a religious experience. I think of it now as that kind of thing that if you want to brainwash someone, this is exactly what you do. You get them into an environment where all they do all day long for many days in a row is the same thing over and over again. So when I came back from that, I realized that the rationale for why I had not gone into music professionally was that, in fact, I was playing, for me, the wrong instrument. I wasn't meant to be a pianist, but I was meant to be a harpsichord. And that's where it started. So, I quit my grad school and I went on from there.
So in a way, the instrument found you, which I think is
Yeah,
not an uncommon experience for lots of musicians,
that's
where
correct. Yeah,
you maybe try a certain instrument and then later on you switch to something else just to try it, and you're like, oh, this is exactly who I am. I
that's
mean, it's
exactly.
funny because I only, of course, know you as a harpsichordist, but I could not imagine you playing any other instrument. Whenever I hear you play, whenever we get to work together, you and the instrument seem as one. I wonder if you might take just a second or two and describe the harpsichord and kind of how it works. And that will lead into more discovery because there's some really cool things about your path, your professional path that I want to share. But how does the harpsichord work basically?
Well, the harpsichord is regarded as an ancestor of the piano, and chronologically, I guess that's true because the harpsichord was the principal keyboard instrument before the piano came into being, and the piano overlaps part of the time period that the harpsichord was in existence before it sort of pushed it out of favor. But from a mechanical standpoint, the harpsichord and the piano are not really that similar in terms of their action. I mean, they both have a keyboard, and the keys have the same letter names that we're used to on the piano. And yes, they both have strings, so they're both string keyboard instruments. But the harpsichord is not a percussion instrument like the modern piano, where you have little felt hammers that strike these strings. It's actually a plucked instrument. So the action has what are called jacks, which are little rectangular wooden kind of blanks or rods, if you will, that are pushed upwards by the key, and they're beside the strings instead of being lined up at the underside of the string. They're actually to the side of the string, and as they rise, they have a plectrum, which used to be made out of crow or raven feather in the old days, but today is more often than not some kind of plastic, and that actually plucks the string. So the action
Mhm.
is quite different, and actually is much simpler too, because you don't need something mechanically complicated to pluck a string, whereas to hit it with a hammer and not choke off the tone is a much more difficult proposition. So it's a much different instrument. And as I say, it's not really that similar to the piano, despite the fact that it, in a general sense, sort of looks like it, and it certainly is the ancestor of the piano, but not in the mechanical sense.
So so then with the use of a plectrum instead of a hammer, the resonance is different, isn't it? Like there's not as much sustaining power in a note on a harpsichord as there is on a piano, for instance.
That's correct, because the plucking of a string it doesn't put that much energy into the string compared to hitting it with a hammer. And the other thing you lose as well is that you lose the very large gradations of volume that are possible on the piano, where the harder you play the key, the more firmly the hammer strikes. On the harpsichord, the elasticity of the plectrum is what determines the volume, and you
Mm.
can't make really any substantial, obvious differences in tone.
So this technical sort of characteristic, in a way, led itself to a musical characteristic as well, or they were at least intimately connected, and that is this idea of ornamenting music. So in Baroque music, obviously, you have a sort of a usually a plain or melody that has ornaments or that you can add ornaments to. And is it accurate to say that one of the reasons you add ornaments is to kind of keep sustaining the sound between notes, especially longer notes? So you might trill two notes as opposed to just holding on a note and letting it die more quickly on a harpsichord.
I,
Is that a
I
fair
think to
assumption?
I think to a point that's accurate, but I would, if myself, I wouldn't sort of take that metaphor too far, because I think ornament is part of the style, regardless of note values. In a way, it's something
Sure.
you kind of have to do it, even if it's not for the purposes of sustain. I mean, the fact that you could sustain a note by ornamenting it is a nice kind of side effect, but you would do it anyway, whether you wanted the
Yeah.
sustain or not.
Sure. Well, I'm not one to take a metaphor too far. Maybe occasionally. Okay, so you took all of these skills not only as a lover of music and as an incredible musician yourself, but also your sort of ideas of in physics and your love of science and your love of going back to the roots of things. And you, my friend, did something that most people don't do. You learned how to make a harpsichord. Take us through that process of what inspired you to try this and then how it ended up in the end.
Well, again, I think you've correctly identified that it comes out of this facet of my personality that likes to understand the fundamentals of things. And for me, the making came out of many years of being a harpsichord technician, right? Someone who maintains and repairs harpsichords. And that in and of itself came out of the necessity that if you want to play the harpsichord, you basically have to learn to take care of it by yourself, because otherwise you're always going to be phoning someone to do it with you. And first of all, there hardly is anyone who does that. And it's
Yeah.
expensive if you have to call someone all the time. You're paying into the retirement fund, really.
And also, right, because unlike the piano, which has a steel frame, with a wooden frame, the adjustments are much more often to a harpsichord than they are
That's
to a
correct.
piano.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, I mean, to be fair, maybe I'm only saying this because I've learned to do it. I don't think those adjustments are that difficult to do. The tuning is easy. It's quick. All that stuff is not, the basic things are not hard to do, which is good because you have to do them fairly often.
Yes.
And as I say, after doing this kind of thing for a number of years and discovering that there were people who would pay money for me to do it for them, I eventually came to the point where I thought, I see all these instruments and I see the finished product, and obviously someone has made decisions from a sort of mechanical or construction standpoint that this is how it should be put together. And the question came to my mind, why would someone make certain decisions a certain way and not a different way, right? And so it sort of came naturally out of that, a number of years of doing this, that I thought, okay, I'm going to back up, and instead of dealing with instruments that I see all the time, I'm going to be the person making those decisions. I'm going to buy the materials. I'm going to put it together, and then we'll see how do you again approach it from fundamentals, from a pile of lumber, basically. How do you get from that to an instrument? And hopefully I'll have some perspective on seeing if someone else's finished instrument that would perhaps help me in future to understand better how to take care of it if I've gone through the experience of
Sure.
having to make every single choice right from scratch.
Sure. And so tell me about the process. How did it unfold?
Well, the process started with me ordering a full size, like 100% scale drawing from the Royal College of Music in London. So I found an instrument that I thought would be a reasonable first attempt to make. And they happen to have in their collection of historic instruments, they for a number of them, they had collections of documents and data that someone had done by examining them closely. They had color photographs, black and white photographs, and for some of them, they had sort of like draftsman's drawings, if you will, 100% scale. So the drawing was literally exactly the same size as the real instrument. So, they send you this
Wow.
thing in a tube, a big cardboard tube, and you unroll it and set it down someplace where there's a lot of room. And then you can take out your tape measure and literally measure those lines in the drawing with your ruler or your tape measure, and get a sense of what it is you
Uh-huh.
need to do. So that's where it would be a good start. I found where to get the drawing, and I had already known from my technician's work where many of the supplies would come from, things like strings, tuning pins, all that kind of stuff.
Got it.
I had done a little bit of woodworking before, so I knew where to get those kinds of materials and glues and that sort of thing. And so the pieces were there to some extent already, like the bits of knowledge that were needed were already present to some extent.
But unlike an IKEA piece of furniture, there was not a set of directions, was there? Like, do this, connect these two pieces, put this screw in here, and then it'll all come out as a piece of furniture or an
Not
instrument?
really, because I took advantage of the fact that in the United States there are a couple of companies that make harpsichords for players who also make what are called kit instruments, where what they do is they actually cut out all the parts and they
Yep.
give you a set of instructions and they put all that stuff in a package and send it to you, right? Now I said, okay, I want to sidestep the kit making part because once again, someone's already chosen the materials and has made a lot of the decisions. You're just doing the
Right.
assembly. But what I did do
Right.
is I bought just the instructions for a similar instrument. I didn't get any materials or anything, but I just wanted to see if my sense of how to do the work was correct by seeing someone else outline the progress. So I just had the manual, so to speak, the written instructions, but I still chose all the materials and bought all that stuff myself.
And in the end, is it an instrument that you play often now? What happened to the instrument?
In the end, it is an instrument that I keep at my parents' place in Toronto because I don't live there myself. I live in Kitchener, Ontario, down an hour or so down the road from them. But it is an instrument that I have played in public on numerous occasions. So I guess I would say that in my mind, it's turned out well enough that it doesn't need to hide itself in shame in a dark corner of the building or something like that. But what I've gradually started to do is just leave it in Toronto in my parents' place as a practice instrument, so that when I'm in Toronto, for whatever business purpose or just for social purposes or something, there's an instrument I can play as a practice instrument, and I don't need to always transport stuff in the car, just to have an instrument to get my fingers on.
Sure. Fantastic. Well, so on this concert that you're going to be featured, you're actually playing in two pieces and you have two separate roles to play. You're playing in the Jean-Philippe Rameau Sixth Concert, which is actually a string orchestra version of solo harpsichord pieces that Rameau wrote. So that's the first piece on the program, and that's the first piece that you'll play in as a continuo player. And then you'll be featured as the soloist in the J.C. Bach harpsichord concerto. Before we get to the J.C. Bach, might you just spend a moment and explain what your role is as a continuo player, and what your role will be in the middle of that Rameau piece that we play?
Sure. One of the definitions of the Baroque musical era in some music history textbooks is they sometimes say this is the basso continual era. That's one of several sort of broad points that in some historians' minds distinguishes the Baroque period from what had just come before that. And what basso continuo is a kind of semi-improvised accompaniment that it can be done on a number of instruments, one of which is the harpsichord. The family of instruments, basically, if you will, breaks down into chord playing instruments, which includes keyboard instruments like the harpsichord, the organ. It would also include things like the lute, the guitar, the Baroque harp, things like that. And then the other member of the family, which could be optional because the harpsichord can play a lot of notes and it can sort of do a very full job at the accompaniment. But in some cases, you might choose to reinforce the bass line with something like a cello, a bass, a viola da gamba, even a bassoon or trombone for some really early music. So those are the instrument members of the family, like a melodic instrument and then a chord playing instrument. Now, because a harpsichordist or a keyboard player has two hands, you can play the bass line, which is what the melodic instruments would play all by themselves. You can do that with your left hand, and with your right hand, you would play a series of chords based on a set of numerical symbols that are in the score. And those symbols are basically intervals above the given bass note that give you an idea of what to play. Now, they don't tell you exactly how to play it, but they tell you which notes need to be there at a minimum. And it's a very interesting system of notation in the sense that it's about as inexact as it could possibly be without leaving you completely high and dry. So it gives you a lot of latitude, but in a way, I think it's inexact because the fewer numbers there are, the more quickly you can read them. And you can basically do this at sight, with a piece you've never seen before. So they give you just enough that you can process it quickly, like in real time, more or less, I would say. And then based on your knowledge of how to play those chords more fully, you sort of memorize, okay, if I see this one single number, I know that actually I need to put a bunch of other notes in to make it sound harmonically correct. And the purpose of this whole thing is to provide really rhythmic support and harmonic filler, especially in pieces where there are very, very few people. The harmonic filler aspect becomes increasingly important. If there's only one other person playing, you really need that. Whereas if you have a whole orchestra, the harpsichord will certainly be duplicating what some of the other people are playing. And in that case, the harmonic support, the rhythmic support will be more audible, I think, to the audience. The fact that you're playing something percussive almost.
Well, that's exactly right. And what's interesting to me in a piece like the Rameau, the string orchestra piece, is that basically we'll hear the color of your sound on top of everyone else, but we won't hear specifically some of the notes that you're playing from a pitch standpoint, just from the sort of rhythm standpoint. And I always tell people, like, if you hear the harpsichord pitches, likely in an orchestra they're playing the wrong notes, because usually they're the notes that are inside the notes that the rest of the orchestra is playing.
That's right.
So J.C. Bach, Johann Christian Bach, who is the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach and is known as the London Bach. He moved to London actually during the time of Handel's time in London, and lived in a especially in the first part of his life there, in a very sort of rich environment of music making. He had lots of friends. He'd performed lots of concerts that together, and there was really sort of a very vibrant lifestyle of music in London at the time. It was also a period of inventiveness, and coming onto the scene was this new instrument called the forte piano. So J.C. Bach was one of those composers that straddled between playing harpsichord and forte piano. And the concerto that you are going to play with us, actually, I have heard and found recordings of both harpsichord and forte piano soloist, and piano soloist, for that matter, modern piano soloist, playing this concerto. Talk to me a little bit about that process of playing a piece by a composer who was kind of straddling time periods with instruments. And I will put into context, because our audience will hear this in a later episode, that Beethoven composed almost completely for the piano. He had very little interest in the harpsichord. So when you hear a Beethoven piano sonata or a Beethoven piano concerto, as you will hear later in this series, that was written for a piano, the actual piano like we know today. This piece that you're going to play is a little bit in that gray area. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You're right about that, and that's one of the things that I've responded to in studying the score for this piece. It's I would say that there's something about this piece that among other things, it strikes me as sort of more overtly tuneful than harpsichord music sometimes is from the earlier periods. When I think about what is it about a harpsichord piece that sort of identifies it as a characteristic piece for the harpsichord, I wouldn't say that the things I play, let's say a solo piece is just to choose an example. I wouldn't say that those are the kind of things that I find myself like, singing in the shower or in the car when I'm driving somewhere. Like they're melodic, but not in that way, right? They're composed. It's like a collection of sometimes of fragmentary ideas that are very interesting to listen to, but not in the sense that there's an obvious long melody going on sort of at all times. And I'm beginning to see something like that in looking at the score of the J.C. Bach, that there is a clear tune and a clear sort of slightly more subordinate accompanimental figure in let's say, the left hand. And that's not always the case in earlier harpsichord music, where long melodies tend to be more fragmentary. And the texture is one where everything is unified together in a way that you can't always say this is the tune and that's the accompaniment. It's not quite so cut and dried, I would say. That's one thing that I could certainly respond to in looking at that piece.
Well, and it's interesting the way you describe it. It sort of almost sounds like Mozart, which is not completely out of the realm of possibility, since Mozart studied with Johann Christian Bach. And I think in many ways, J.C. Bach was one of the most influential teachers that Mozart had. The concerto itself is in three movements, and I'd love for you to describe a little the three movements, but I just want to sort of say ahead of time that I don't think I've ever heard cuter music in my entire life than the second movement. This idea of the strings plucking, playing pizzicato, accompanying the harpsichord is literally adorable and puts a smile on your face, whether you want to smile there or not. Like, it's just impossible to listen to that music and not smile. Can you talk a little bit about the outside movements, or that movement as well, in case, for instance, you don't think of it as smiling music?
I think it's a very apt metaphor. There's tremendous charm in that middle movement, so I would not disagree with you at all. But I guess first of all, it's worth mentioning this is a concerto really in three movements, so it's not as long as some other concerti are, in the sense that there are more movements in addition. So, but yes, coming back to it, the first movement strikes me as almost a kind of alla breve. It's in 4/4, but to me, thinking about it, it almost could be pulled off as a kind of alla breve or double beat, as opposed to four separate quarter note beats or something. So it certainly is a more sort of overtly virtuosic thing, in the sense that there's lots of little notes, but it has a lot of flair, a lot of sparkle. I think it's somewhat fiery at times. The last movement, on the other hand, strikes me as almost like a theme with variation, because the same material keeps coming back and it's just decorated to a larger or lesser degree. So that's the first thing that kind of came to mind, is almost like theme with variations, except that the variations don't stop and restart in the manner that we would think of as in a classic theme with variations, that they're all slightly self-contained. The piece just unfolds from beginning to end without ever really stopping, and that opening theme just keeps coming back, wearing different clothing, as it were. Very interesting, I think.
So you are playing this concerto with the Windsor Symphony Orchestra, which is an orchestra that plays modern instruments at modern pitch, but you also play from time to time with ensembles that play at Baroque pitch, which is lower than modern. What is the challenge of going back and forth between working with those two different kinds of orchestras?
Um, it's first of all, let me say it's a great experience in all cases. And the challenge, I would say, is that sometimes with modern instruments, one has to watch the balance between the harpsichord and the other instruments a little more carefully, because modern instruments can play louder more easily. And that's one of the things that, let's say, in the string family of instruments, that's one of the things that the alterations to the violin over the centuries was designed to accomplish, was to get more volume to fill a larger space as the environment in which music was performed gradually enlarged over time. So the balance needs to be watched a little bit, because the harpsichord is not going to get louder and louder to sort of to match everyone else. So one has to watch that sort of thing a little bit. But that being said, with the earlier instruments sometimes play a little more transparently, just sort of naturally, without necessarily having to micromanage that. So it's certainly not impossible to do any of the things I'm talking about here on modern instruments. It just requires a little bit of care, and perhaps a sensitive ear at the front, like yourself, at the podium or something, just to make sure that everything is coming across. But there's certainly nothing to preclude one group or the other doing a fine job.
One last question, and that is this: talk to us or share with us your first musical memory, either hearing or making music, or both.
Gosh, now that's going back a while.
I know, right?
In terms of things I can clearly remember, I remember a little bit of this, and I guess the rest of it is something that my mother supplied to me, after the fact. But I can remember playing pieces on the piano that my brother had actually learned first, without actually knowing how to read music, which I guess goes to show that I was playing totally by ear. because the
Right.
the music on the music desk, according to my mother, was upside down, which is, of course, completely completely
Right.
incomprehensible. So I obviously wasn't reading the music, but he would learn pieces on the piano because he was the older brother, so he was the one who started, and I apparently was playing these pieces by ear, and I can remember some of the things that I was playing at the time, which I'm told by my mother must have been learned by ear because I had never had any piano lesson, nor could I possibly have known how to read music. So I think that's about the earliest thing I can think of. It was just sort of a natural thing for me. Like younger brothers often imitate older ones, so I was doing the natural sort of thing. He came home playing the piano, so I started too, right?
Does he still play?
No longer, but to his credit, he went quite far with the piano. He went nearly as far as I did with all of the examinations that young piano students can do. So he did it for a long time, although he has not made a career out of it.
Well, Boris, I just want to say I'm glad you've made a career out of it. We are really looking forward to hearing you play Johann Christian Bach's harpsichord concerto, his Opus 13, number 4, for those of you who are taking notes and want to make sure you get the right one. Boris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you and everyone with the symphony is doing well and staying safe.
Thank you.